Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive into student learning outcomes. You hear SLOs and you kind of think textbooks and policies, but
Yeah.
honestly, we are going to unpack like what really matters about SLOs and why you should actually care about this stuff, especially if you are a student or a parent or just, interested in education.
Yeah, you're right. It's not just jargon. SLOs really get to the core of like what makes education effective. It's not about checking boxes, but about making sure students are actually walking away with, the skills and knowledge to succeed.
Okay, so break it down for me. What exactly are student learning outcomes and like why all the fuss about them?
Well, imagine you are building a house. I mean, you wouldn't just start like throwing bricks around, right? You'd have a blueprint, a plan for like what you want to achieve. And SLOs, they're kind of like that blueprint for education. They define, specific skills and knowledge and abilities that students should be gaining from a course, a program, even their entire college experience.
So it's about having that roadmap.
For learn Exactly. And this is where coaches comes in. The California Outcomes Assessment Coordinators Hub. They're doing some really fantastic work demystifying SLOs and helping educators implement them effectively. I've been tuning into their Friday SLO talks, and they've got some great insights.
Now, you've piqued my interest with these Friday SLO talks. What kind of things have you been learning from them?
One of the biggest takeaways, honestly, is how important it is to move beyond just like defining the SLOs to actually like assessing whether students are achieving them, making sure that these outcomes are more than just words on paper, but that they actually translate into, real world skills and knowledge.
Right, because you can have the most beautiful blueprint, but if the house doesn't get built, it's not worth very much.
Exactly. Coaches really emphasizes this idea of like observable behavior. It's not enough for students to say they've learned something. They need to like show it, demonstrate it in a way that's tangible.
Okay, so how do we actually like see those SLOs come to life in the classroom?
Let's take an example. So let's say you have a writing course, and one of the SLOs is to like construct a persuasive argument, using evidence and logical reasoning. So instead of just like grading a final essay, you might have students engage in debates or write peer reviews or even like present their arguments to an audience. That way you can actually observe how well they're applying those skills.
It's so much richer than just looking at a grade on a test.
And that's what coaches is all about, moving beyond those traditional assessments and finding like creative ways to really see the SLOs in action.
Speaking of assessment, I've always been confused about like the difference between SLOs and student achievement. Like, aren't they essentially the same thing?
It's a common misconception, but achievement is often focused on those like measurable milestones, like grades, test scores, degrees. But SLOs dig deeper into, the specific skills and knowledge students are gaining along the way.
So like a student could get an A in a history course, but not necessarily master all of the SLOs related to like historical analysis and critical thinking.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Achievement is like reaching the summit of a mountain, while SLOs are all those skills and techniques you need to like learn along the way to get there. You might reach the top by luck or talent, but those SLOs, they ensure you actually have the tools to climb any mountain that you encounter.
I love that analogy. It really highlights how SLOs are about more than just checking off boxes, but like equipping students with those skills they need to succeed beyond the classroom.
Absolutely. Coaches is constantly stressing how SLOs should be meaningful, not just measurable. They should be tied to those real-world skills that prepare students for their careers and for, lifelong learning.
All of this makes sense. But I'll be honest, I've always been a bit skeptical about, how well SLOs translate to the real world. It feels very academic. And I'm not sure it always resonates outside the classroom.
That's a really good point, and it's something that coaches acknowledges as well. One of the Friday SLO talks I went to, it focused on that communication gap surrounding SLOs. They were discussing the importance of using language that's clear and concise and really accessible to everybody, not just educators.
That's reassuring.
Yeah.
I remember once I was like so deep into reading about SLOs that I decided to do a little experiment.
Oh no, what did you do?
I walked into the Target across from my campus, and I asked the HR manager, what SLOs do students from my college need to succeed here?
Oh, I bet that went over well.
You can imagine the look on their face, like I was speaking a foreign language.
That's a perfect example of that breakdown in communication that coaches talks about. In that situation, using a term like competencies might have been more effective.
Competencies. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a term that's often used in Europe. And it really focuses on what someone can do, with the knowledge and skills they've learned. If you ask that target manager about competencies, they probably would have understood exactly what you were getting at.
So it's all about finding that like common language that bridges the gap between academia and the real world.
Exactly. That's one of the things that Coaches is trying to do with their Friday SLO talks, breaking down those barriers and making the language of learning outcomes more accessible to everyone.
This is fascinating. We're really starting to see how SLOs can be more than just an academic exercise, but a real tool for ensuring that education is actually translating into real-world skills and success for students.
Absolutely. And Coaches offers so many resources and practical tips to help make that happen.
I'm really eager to learn more about that practical side of SLOs and how Coaches supports their implementation.
You know, it's amazing how Coaches is able to break down these like really complex topics into these digestible pieces. Their Friday SLO talks, they often feature like real world examples from colleges all over California. It's really inspiring to see how educators are actually putting this stuff into practice.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Can you give me like a specific example of how a college might be using SLOs to really make a difference for students?
Absolutely. I remember one Friday SLO talk. They highlighted this community college that was like revamping their nursing program. And they really wanted to make sure that their graduates weren't just passing exams, but that they were like actually prepared to provide excellent patient care.
So how do they use SLOs to do that?
Well, they started by working with like local hospitals and healthcare providers to identify the specific skills and competencies that nurses actually needed to succeed in the field. And then they aligned their program SLOs with those real world expectations.
That's smart. They went straight to the source
Yeah,
to figure out what skills actually mattered.
exactly. And it wasn't just about like technical skills. They focused on SLOs related to things like communication and critical thinking, ethical decision-making, recognizing that those are all essential qualities for any successful nurse.
So they went beyond just like checking boxes and really thought about what it takes to be a great nurse.
Exactly.
They actually changed their curriculum based on these SLOs.
They did. They incorporated more like simulations, case studies, hands-on experiences. That allowed students to demonstrate those skills in action. They also worked really closely with their clinical instructors to provide feedback and support as students were developing those competencies.
That's awesome. That's such a great example of how SLOs can really drive change and improve the quality of education. It's about making sure that students are graduating, not just with a degree, but with the skills they need to actually make a difference.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. Coach is always emphasizing how SLOs aren't meant to be a burden, but really a tool to empower both educators, and students. They can help create a more focused and purposeful learning experience.
And I know we talked earlier
hmm
about different levels of learning outcomes, like institutional program and course. Does Coaches address this whole like hierarchy?
Oh, absolutely. They have a great analogy. To explain these different levels, they talk about learning taking place at different altitudes.
Oh, altitudes. I'm picturing like a mountain range
Yeah.
of learning outcomes here.
So picture this. At the lowest altitude, you have the course level, where we see those like specific observable SLOs we've been talking about. Things like writing a lab report in biology class or analyzing a poem in literature.
Those are the building blocks.
Right.
What about as we climb higher?
So as we ascend to the program level, those individual SLOs, they kind of start to come together and they form broader program learning outcomes, or PLOs.
So instead of just analyzing a single poem, a PLO might involve something like,
Right, demonstrating the ability to like interpret and analyze literary texts from different genres and historical periods. It's about taking those skills from individual courses and applying them in a more complex way.
and then at the peak, the highest altitude, we have those institutional learning outcomes, or ILOs.
Yes, these are the big picture outcomes that the whole institution wants to foster for all of its students, regardless of their major. They often focus on those really essential skills that are transferable to any field, like critical thinking, communication, problem solving, ethical reasoning.
So an ILO might be something like, graduates will be able to communicate effectively in diverse contexts.
Exactly. It's about making sure that students develop not just expertise in their specific field, but also those core competencies that will serve them well throughout their lives.
I love this analogy. It really helps to visualize how these different levels, they kind of build upon each other
Yeah.
and create a more cohesive experience for students. Does Coaches provide any guidance on how to actually connect these levels to make sure they're aligned?
That's actually one of their key areas of focus. Coaches really emphasizes that these different levels shouldn't exist in isolation, but should be intentionally connected to create a seamless learning journey for students. For example, they recommend that program faculty actually work together to map out how those SLOs from their individual courses contribute to those broader PLOs for the program as a whole.
So everyone's on the same page.
Exactly, and it doesn't stop there. Coaches also stresses the importance of aligning those PLOs with the overall mission and ILOs of the institution. This ensures that the program is not only preparing students for their specific field, but also contributing to those broader goals of the college.
So it sounds like a well-oiled machine.
That's the ideal, and Coaches provides a ton of resources and support to help colleges achieve that. They offer workshops, webinars, even online tools to guide faculty and administrators through that process of developing and assessing and refining those learning outcomes.
We talked about the importance of observable behavior when it comes to measuring student learning. Is there anything else that Coaches emphasizes?
One thing that really stood out to me from those Friday SLO talks is their emphasis on multiple measures of assessment. They caution against relying on just one test or one assignment to gauge student learning.
So it's about looking at the whole picture, using a variety of methods to assess.
Exactly. They encourage educators to think creatively and use a mix of direct and indirect measures.
Okay, so direct measures might include things like presentations, projects, performances, where students are demonstrating their skills.
Right.
And what about indirect measures?
Those might involve things like surveys, focus groups, even alumni interviews. These methods can provide insights into students' perceptions of their learning and how they're applying their skills in the real world.
So gathering evidence.
Yeah.
From different perspectives.
Yeah. Coaches encourages educators to think of assessment as an ongoing process, not just a one-time event. It's about continually gathering feedback and using it to improve the learning experience.
This all makes so much sense. But thinking about all these different levels of outcomes, assessment methods, I have to admit it can feel a little overwhelming. Like, where does an educator even begin?
I think that's a common feeling, and it's something that Coaches really tries to address. They emphasize that implementing SLOs, it doesn't have to be this monumental task. They advocate for a gradual, collaborative approach, starting small and building from there.
So not a complete overhaul overnight.
Right. They recommend starting by focusing on just one or two key SLOs for a course or a program, and experimenting with different assessment methods. They also encourage faculty to work together, share ideas, learn from each other's experiences.
It sounds like Coaches really provides that supportive community.
They do. Their Friday SLO talks are a great example of that. It's a space where educators can connect, ask questions, share their challenges and successes. It's a fantastic way to tap into that collective wisdom of educators across California.
And of course, the Friday SLO talks.
Yes.
We've been talking about those.
Those are a treasure trove of practical advice, real-world examples, inspiring stories from educators. I highly recommend them.
This has been really enlightening. Yeah, I'm starting to see SLOs in a whole new light.
Yeah.
Not just as a bureaucratic hurdle, but as a framework for making education more meaningful and effective. What else can you tell me about a Coach's approach?
One thing that really impressed me is their emphasis on equity and inclusion in the SLO process. They recognize that not all students come to the classroom with the same backgrounds and experiences, and they really stress the importance of designing SLOs and assessments that are fair and accessible to all learners.
That's so important. We can't assume that a one-size-fits-all approach is going to work.
Exactly. Coaches provides resources and guidance on how to design SLOs that are sensitive to students' diverse needs and learning styles. They also encourage educators to use a variety of assessment methods to give students multiple opportunities to demonstrate their learning.
It sounds like they're really committed to making sure SLOs are used to promote equity and excellence in education.
Absolutely. Their goal is to empower educators to create learning experiences that are both rigorous and relevant, preparing all students for success.
This has been such a fascinating exploration
Yeah.
of SLs and the work that Coaches is doing. I'm feeling much more informed and even a bit inspired.
Me too. It's encouraging to see how SLOs can be used to transform education and create a more equitable and meaningful learning experience.
We've covered so much ground today, from the basics of SLOs to the nuances of assessment, the importance of equity and inclusion. Is there anything else you'd like to highlight about Coach's approach before we start to wrap up?
You know, I think it's important to emphasize that Coaches views SLOs as a living, breathing process, not a static set of rules. They encourage educators to constantly reflect on their SLOs, gather feedback from students and colleagues, and make adjustments as needed.
So it's about continuous improvement.
Exactly. Coaches provides a framework and support, but ultimately it's up to the individual educators and institutions to really embrace the spirit of SLOs and use them to create a culture of learning that's both challenging and supportive.
That's a really powerful message. I think we've gained a much deeper appreciation for the potential of SLOs to really transform education and empower all students to succeed.
I agree. It's been a pleasure diving deep into this with you.
So before we wrap up, I'm curious, what advice would coaches give to someone who's just starting out with SLOs? Where do they begin?
One of the most common things I hear them say is to start small and focus on collaboration. Don't try to do everything at once.
Right. Don't get overwhelmed.
Yeah. Pick a course, or even just a unit within a course, and work with your colleagues to identify one or two key SLOs that you really want to prioritize. Then brainstorm ways to assess them, keeping in mind, observable behavior, multiple measures.
I can see how working with colleagues would be so helpful. You can bounce ideas off of each other.
Yeah.
And get feedback.
That's exactly what Coach is all about. They have online forums and communities of practice where educators can connect and share resources. It's a great way to learn from each other.
And of course, there's the Friday SLO Talks.
Absolutely. They're a fantastic resource.
As we wrap up, I want to talk about the impact of SLOs on students. How does coaches approach that student-centered perspective?
One of the big things they emphasize is transparency. Students should know what the SLOs are and how they connect to their learning goals.
So no secrets.
Right. When students understand what they're supposed to learn and why it matters, they're more likely to be engaged. Coaches also encourages educators to involve students in the assessment process. Give them a voice, let them give feedback.
That's a great way to empower them.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm feeling really optimistic about the potential for SLOs to really make education better.
Me too. It's been great exploring this with you.
It has. And to our listeners, if you want to learn more, check out Coaches and their Friday SLO Talks. They're a wonderful resource. Thanks for joining us.
Oh?
And keep learning.